Okay, let's do this. So in a previous video that I made called How to Start a Martial Arts Yoga Practice, I hinted at my desire to make some sort of video addressing some of my concerns with the yoga community here in the United States and its intersection with gender. The more I thought about how to address this topic in a thoughtful and considerate way, the more I realized I couldn't really do that without addressing the elephant in the room, which is the history of sexual abuse and sexual misconduct in yoga communities. I've spent a lot of time just thinking about how I want to start this video because I know that you only have so much time to build credibility with someone before they decide you're not worth listening to. And when some bro shows up and makes a clickbait title like the problems with SA in the yoga community, it's worth, as a viewer, having a healthy suspicion to why the hell this person thinks they're entitled to talk about this issue at all. So I'm going to do my best to address that. I'm going to do my best to talk about this in a way that is thoughtful and respectful, because obviously this is a topic that is going to be incredibly sensitive to a lot of people. Both people who have themselves been victims of sexual abuse or sexual misconduct, whether that was in a yoga context or not, as well as people who take their yoga practice incredibly seriously, who take the yogic tradition incredibly seriously, and aren't exactly thrilled to see some schmuck on the internet complaining about it. So I want to say out of the gate, I know I'm not the first person to talk about this issue, and I know I'm also not the most qualified person to be getting into the weeds on really sensitive topics like sexual abuse. And on the other end of it, some of you may not necessarily think I have sufficient yoga credentials to be speaking on the yoga community as a whole. It is what it is. As somebody who has come to the yoga tradition from a Western, secular, and heteronormative masculine perspective, I wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about why I maintain a healthy distance between myself, my yoga practice, and some of the more traditional yoga practices out there. So consider this my disclaimer at the outset that I am mindful of those concerns, and I'm gonna do my best to meet them without badgering you guys with it. Okay? Fair enough. I don't think it is going to come as a shock to anyone listening to this that the yoga community has a long history of scandals involving some of its most famous notable practitioners and allegations of serious sexual misconduct or even sexual abuse. As somebody who has personally taken an enormous amount of meaning and inspiration from yogic philosophies, it is deeply frustrating that in the minds of so many people, yoga has this association with abusers. There's probably a Catholic listening to this right now like, dude, you have no fucking idea. There are a lot of practitioners out there now who are practicing styles or systems of yoga developed by certain people that they no longer even feel comfortable attributing to those people because of those allegations. Now, I'm not going to mention a lot of those people by name because I don't necessarily want this to get bogged down in a litigation of a specific person and the claims that have been made about them. Some of the more notable examples of people who have had allegations made against them are people like Bikram. And I mention him specifically because Bikram yoga was the style of yoga that first brought me into yoga as something that I now practice across a variety of styles. So I feel personally invested in this topic because the person who developed the system that introduced me to the thing that I now find so incredibly important and meaningful in my life is a deeply problematic individual, allegedly. Not looking to catch any smoke from the lawyers out there. But Bikram's not the only guy. If you spend a little bit of time on the internet, you'll find that there's a pretty long list of well-known yoga practitioners who have had very credible allegations of misconduct made against them. Hopefully, if you're a yoga practitioner out there, it's not coming as some huge shock to you to hear that our practice in the minds of many people out there has this incredibly negative association with creepy, pervy dudes who take advantage of the yoga tradition and the yoga practice to act in highly inappropriate ways towards women. Now, I can tell you from having spoken to lots of female practitioners over the years, pretty much every single one of them has some story they can share with a fellow practitioner acting incredibly inappropriately or even in an abusive manner towards them. I think that this falls broadly into two categories. There are the problems inherent with the so-called guru relationship, right? So those really famous cases that I referenced at the outset, people like Bikram, that falls into that category. People who are placed into these almost worshipped and sanctified positions of spiritual and moral authority, who then use that position of power over their followers to act in incredibly abusive and hurtful ways towards them. That is something that I don't think is unique to yoga specifically, though the ways that the language and the concepts of yoga are used to gaslight or obfuscate the abuse that's happening, that is relevant to yoga. The guru relationship creates opportunities for abuse because of the ways in which power is invested into the so-called spiritual leader, who then abuses it against somebody who is in a particularly vulnerable place in their life. But then of course there's this other category, which is just people experiencing unwanted and unappreciated interactions in the context of their yoga studios. I think that this also breaks out in roughly two ways. There is the unwanted attention, unwanted glances of somebody who is sharing the practice room with you at any particular point, at any particular time. But then there's this other experience, right? Which is somebody who's a member of your yoga community, not necessarily the instructor or your guru, but a fellow practitioner who ultimately does something inappropriate. And that happens a lot. I can think off the top of my head of at least 2 or 3 stories that I've heard directly from fellow practitioners of going on a yoga retreat or going on some sort of trip with their yoga school, their yoga community, only to have a deeply unpleasant and negative experience with a fellow practitioner who they thought they knew, right? Someone who they had interacted with dozens of times and never sort of suspected this type of behavior to occur from. But at this moment where now they're separated from their normal environment, they're separated from their normal contexts, suddenly that behavior emerges. And what's a recurring theme in a lot of those types of stories is the way that in those moments, those abusers and victimizers try to weaponize yoga as a concept to rationalize or justify or gaslight what they were doing, right? So instead of someone just being inappropriate, they use these concepts of spiritual progress and development to make it seem like you're the one who has the problem, you're the one who's got some sort of hang-up or blockage, and that's the only reason why you interpreted this incredibly inappropriate thing as a problem. And if you were further along on the path of spiritual awakening or whatever, then you would have been down for whatever it was that they were trying to do with you. That comes up a lot in the stories that I've heard. And so that I think that we as practitioners, we as yogis, we have to own that. We can't just say like, that's a couple bad apples. Yeah, it's bad apples. It's people who probably, if it wasn't yoga, they would have found some other system or method to take advantage of other people, right? But the fact that the ideas themselves can be weaponized in that way is something that we have to take seriously. And we have to guard against that in how we think and talk about yoga as a philosophical system. We can't act like we've got something that is so refined and thought through that it is impervious to that kind of weaponization and abuse, because it clearly isn't. One of the things that I have always tried to guard against in my own practice is the fetishization of philosophies that are foreign, that are from somewhere else. This notion that if these philosophies come from somewhere else, from somewhere outside of our own cultural context, well, then they must be infused with some special sauce that makes them more valuable and more effective than the ideas that emerge within our cultural contexts. Any philosophical system can ultimately become a tool of manipulation. That's how I feel about it. And so, like, at risk of sounding like one of these, like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps type of guys and saying that this all comes back to like individual responsibility and accountability, I do think that one of the ways that we make our environments sort of structurally resilient against predatory behavior is in how we specifically interface with yoga as a community and as a philosophy. Now, how we interface with yoga as a community, I think that that's going to be very similar to how we interface with any community, with the caveat that yoga is much more adjacent to sexual content and sexual practices than like going rock climbing. Like, yeah, at a rock climbing gym, you might see people grunting and groaning and working up a sweat in form-fitting clothing, but it's not exactly the same as walking into a room with what is potentially a dozen incredibly attractive people getting sweaty and bendy. I think I'm also not saying anything incredibly controversial here by pointing out that if you look at the type of yoga content that is pushed online, if you look at, you know, the most clicked on yoga shorts on YouTube or yoga reels on Instagram, you're gonna find a lot of highly sexualized content. I'm not putting anyone on blast here who is a producer of that type of content. Like, I get it, you know, you're trying to make money off of the platform that you have and the assets, so to speak, that you bring to the table. Fair enough. But we have to be mindful of the fact that a lot of people who are going to be exposed to yoga through these platforms are going to be walking into these spaces with that stuff floating around in their head, which is nothing to say about the generally highly sexualized and highly pornographic nature of the society that we live in. So does that mean like don't practice in skimpy clothing? No, but I do think that at least from a male perspective, we need to be thinking about cultivating spaces to practice yoga that are separate from women. I don't want this to sound incredibly binary in thinking, and I don't want this to sound like men and women cannot coexist in yoga communities without abuse occurring, because that's not correct. But I do want there to be other associations with the practice, right? I want men to be able to access yoga as something that is part of a method for more intentional and deliberate living than simply as some sort of fitness supplement, or even worse, as some sort of conduit to attractive women. Now, the more complex and perhaps controversial part of this is the ways in which I think that the actual philosophies of yoga can sometimes be weaponized by abusers. And now, as I referenced earlier in this video, I think part of this does come from what is sometimes problematically referred to as Orientalism, which is to say taking something and making it sound foreign and exotic so as to market it to a Western audience. Yoga is one of these things that, yes, it comes to us from another culture, another time, another place, and is historically associated with the cultures of India. However, and please don't bite my head off for saying this, yoga as it is practiced today is about as Indian as rock and roll is American. Yeah, you can trace it to that culture. You can say it's a fundamentally Indian product, just like you can say rock and roll is a fundamentally American product. But rock and roll is everywhere now. Just like I don't think a Swedish death metal band needs to performatively acknowledge the American roots of rock and roll, I don't think yoga practitioners in the West need to get on some sort of high horse about how what they're doing is fundamentally from some other place. Personally, I think one of the values of yoga as a philosophical system is its culturally transcendent properties. You can certainly find its application more or less relevant depending on where you are and what else is happening in your society at the time. But just like Stoicism, it's a set of principles or ideas that are directly related to the experience of being a conscious human being. To me, that doesn't have a nationality. That doesn't have a gender or a race. That's a universal experience. That's what is beautiful about the philosophy. Now here comes the but. But when people start trying to strip something of all cultural and social context, this also does create opportunities for abusive behavior. This creates opportunities to weaponize these concepts against people whose cultural and social ideas might otherwise shield them from that behavior. So some of you might hear something like that and think what is he talking about? And others who have maybe experienced this are going yup. You talk to some people who have these negative experiences of fellow yogis saying or doing something inappropriate towards them. And when they reacted viscerally, negatively to what that person was doing, what the abuser often does is say, oh, I didn't realize you still had this hang-up from your American culture. I didn't realize you still had this spiritual blockage from your monogamous or heteronormative cultural context that you emerged from. You haven't yet found a way to transcend your social conditioning. So you can see the ways in which the language of transcendence can be used deceptively and in bad faith to try and discredit the ways in which your culture and your society tries to guard you against predatory behavior. So how do we protect ourselves from that sort of thing? Well, some of you are probably thinking to yourselves, that would never work on me. I would never get played like that by some dude with a man bun. And good for you. But a lot of people come into yoga at moments in their life where they are incredibly vulnerable, where they are searching desperately for some sense of meaning that they are not finding within the cultural context in which they already exist. And I think we really need to be on the lookout for those people, and we need to take active and affirmative steps in finding them and saying to them, hey, yoga is a beautiful system, and I think you're going to find a lot of wisdom in these texts. But just be leery of anyone who comes at you with all the answers. Be suspicious of people who claim they know the proper postures. They know the proper ways of chanting. They know how you should do this or shouldn't do that. They know how to integrate yoga into all aspects of your life. Let them know that you can find meaning while still having a sense of humor. You can derive purpose and satisfaction from a philosophy while still being able to make jokes about it. This is the hill that I'm probably going to die on the internet. You can do yoga sarcastically. and it's still real fucking yoga. So I don't know, I've been all over the place here, and I don't know if I've said anything even remotely helpful or useful, anything even worth saying. Like most people talking into a camera on the internet, I'm coming at this from a self-centered point of view because it matters to me when I go out and I engage the communities in which I practice yoga, which these days are few and far between and mostly male-oriented. Where I'm at right now, I prefer to practice in the context of a martial arts gym where the energy is a lot more overtly masculine, and I'm meeting it there, you know? And so when I'm engaging in the spaces in which I practice, it matters to me that people don't look at me the second I say, yeah, I teach yoga, and think, like, this guy must be a total creep. Like, I hate that shit, right? And I'm sure there's a lot of you yoga teachers out there who hate that shit too, who hate the fact that that association exists with what you do. But pretending that it doesn't isn't the answer. We have to meet it head on. And meeting it head on, I think, requires us to acknowledge that it's not just about a few bad apples. The ideas themselves are tools, and tools can be used for good and tools can be used for bad. And the second you start thinking to yourself, well, what I do is only good, is the second you are about to be a victim or a victimizer. Now look, I'm not saying be so riddled with doubt that you don't have any sense of confidence in what you practice or what you believe, but just maintain a little bit of humility. In conclusion, the work starts with all of us. We all have to do better. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, probably every single one of us has caught ourselves at some moment, maybe staring just a little too long at somebody else in the yoga studio. It's human. It's only normal that that's going to happen, but it's something that, especially as a male in those spaces, you need to really be mindful about. Okay, we solved it. I apologize for the clickbait title. I do want feedback. Though. I do want people to leave a comment if they think like, dude, you're totally off base and you have no idea what the hell you're talking about, or yeah, no, actually I resonated with what you were saying, but I think you missed the following elements, or you know what, I get what your point was, but here's where you're off. I welcome the feedback, I welcome the criticism, even if it's incredibly negative, like don't worry, I'll survive. And I want to just reaffirm for those of you who may be new to yoga as a concept, who may be new to yoga spaces, that like this is something that a lot of us are thinking about. This is something that we talk about and address in our yoga teacher trainings, and that, you know, we are working on as a community to do better, and we'll continue to do better as long as we continue to have honest conversations about it. So hopefully I didn't stir the pot here too much. The next video will be more lighthearted, I promise. Thanks. Namaste.